Hi, everybody. Before listening to today's sermon, it would be helpful to listen to the poem How to Explain White Supremacy to a White Supremacist by Guante. It's about 4 minutes long and it's available on YouTube. White supremacy is not the shark, says the poet Guante. It's the ocean. Sharks kill a handful of people every year. Meanwhile, thousands drown. White supremacists have been much in the news lately, and not for no reason. Seeing that image of the Confederate flag being paraded through the Capitol building, well, that should definitely be a wake-up call to any of us who might still need one. White supremacists are alive and well in the U.S., and they are recruiting aggressively on the internet, and they are organizing, and they are emboldened. The FBI and Homeland Security have both identified white supremacist groups as representing the greatest domestic terror threat to the U.S. This is something that should concern us all. I would say that these are the sharks swimming in the waters of the American body politic, except that sharks are graceful, beautiful creatures who play an important role in the ecosystem, and Nazis are Nazis. But if you want to talk about racist violence in 2020 and 2021, forget about skinheads and Nazis and other belligerent white people waving racist flags. Look at COVID. As of today, just under 400,000 Americans are reported to have died from COVID. This is a terrible tragedy, and it is one that has been visited upon American communities unequally. When you adjust the data to account for the difference in age between black and white populations, remembering that older people have higher mortality rates from COVID, when you adjust for the age of its victims, black and non-white Hispanic people are more than twice as likely to die from a COVID infection as white people. This is according to the Brookings Institute, and researchers point to a lack of access to health care and the greater prevalence of health comorbidities to explain the deadly outcome. This is the violent legacy of American racism, the legacy of a century of redlining and economic oppression and exposure to environmental toxins and just the accumulative wearing down of the body from the toxic stress of living in a racist society day in and day out. All of this much more violent and deadly in its impact than any actions of any group of white supremacists. This is white supremacy. It doesn't require racists. It doesn't require people with hate in their heart. It doesn't require people to do anything. It's the water we're swimming in, and for it to continue, all that is required is that we keep treading water, paying little heed to the people drowning around us. All that is required is that we continue to live within the social conditions and social constructs created by centuries of deliberate racist policies, conditions created by centuries of explicitly racist culture, and explicitly sexist and homophobic culture, and all that is required is that we receive those conditions as if they were normal, natural, unexceptional, and definitely assumed to be non-racist and non-sexist and non-homophobic in intent and impact until and unless proven otherwise. All that is required is that we keep treading water. Well, thankfully, we don't just tread water. That's not the whole story. American history is steeped in racism, but also includes centuries of people working against racism, working to resist racism, working to undo racism, and sexism and homophobia and all the other toxic isms that tend to be bundled up with white supremacy culture. And so on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, we want to honor the heroes of the civil rights movement, who were prepared to lay down their lives for victories like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. Or if we look at the suffragette movement, the feminist movement of the 70s, if we look at Stonewall and ACT UP, we see that there is a legacy of resistance and liberation within American society as well. And the victories of those resistance movements have wrought tremendous structural changes in American society. Progress has come with those changes. And that struggle for progress has been a part of the story of Unitarian Universalism from its beginning. We have been abolitionists and suffragettes. We marched at Selma. We've fought for marriage equality. Today we affirm that Black lives matter. Today we are sanctuary congregations. We put water in the desert, literally, for people making their way to our southern border. We have resisted the racism and sexism and homophobia of American culture. But we have also coexisted within it and shared its assumptions, knowingly and unknowingly. Both of those things can be true. And it is painful to say it, but the reality is people who come to UU congregations seeking to be a part of beloved community, seeking to build a more free and more just and more loving world, they encounter all the things we're working against, the racism and sexism and homophobia and all the rest. They encounter those things here inside our congregations as well, because it's the water we're all swimming in. Back in July, way back at the start of our new church here, we did a 4-part sermon series on the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. And I realized that last July is about 19 years ago in COVID time, and meanwhile I barely remember 3 days ago. So I don't expect you to remember this, but trust me that we closed our series on the UU principles by discussing the proposed 8th principle. The 8th principle was created in the early 2000s by Paula Cole-Jones and Bruce Pollock-Johnson and others as a way of guiding our congregations into a deeper commitment to transformation and action on issues of racism, sexism, ableism, all the other oppressive isms. And this came at a time in our history when our congregations and our association had, to a certain extent, stalled out on racial justice work. So to continue with the metaphor we've been using, the 8th principle was written to challenge UUs to get real about the water we're swimming in and to commit to stop treading water. Now, this is the text of the 8th principle. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Now, it's a little wordy because that's how we roll as UUs, right? We like our words, so let's take it bit by bit. It starts by saying we covenant to affirm and promote. Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal religion. What we share in common is not a set of dogmatic beliefs, but a covenant, a commitment to be together in a certain way and to live out certain principles to the best of our ability and understanding. So this would be one of those principles that forms and shapes our collective promise for how we're going to live as Unitarian Universalists. We covenant to journey towards spiritual wholeness, meaning we recognize that we are not there yet. The society we inhabit does not look like the world that we dream of, and to get there, we have to go on a journey, which means it will take time, and we may get lost, and we will encounter setbacks and delays. So we hope for good traveling companions on the way, and hopefully someone will have a compass, but if not, we'll navigate by the sun and the stars as best we can. And why do we say we're journeying toward wholeness? Well, this is another way of echoing Dr. King, who said that we are all bound up in a single garment of destiny, such that I cannot be free until you are free. So in a society divided by hatred and prejudice, none of us can truly be whole. And so we recognize the harm done to everyone by this white supremacy culture, including the harm done to ourselves. The principle continues, we covenant to journey toward wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community. And this is our dream explicitly stated, the beloved community, again, a nod to the language of Dr. King, where all people are made welcome in the fullness of themselves, a community that is necessarily then diverse and multicultural. And note, we have to work to build this community. It won't just come about. It won't just roll in on the wheels of inevitability. And finally, to build this community, the eighth principle says, we will have to take actions to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And in other words, it is not enough to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to intentionally dismantle systems of oppression, and we recognize that those systems live in institutions, and they also live in our hearts. And this does not make us bad people, it makes us human. And as such, we recognize that we will have some personal work to do on this journey. So that is the eighth principle, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, let's talk about the seven principles. The seven principles spell out the foundational covenant that all Unitarian Universalist congregations participate in. And what Paula Cole-Jones had come to realize, and what prompted the creation of the eighth principle, was that many UUs believed they could live out their commitment to the seven principles without ever seriously engaging with questions of racism and sexism and so on. Countering racism was seen as one of many issues, an important one to be sure, but one of many issues among others that could be picked up or set down, but not something that was foundational to living out Unitarian Universalism. Anti-racism in this view was optional. Now, over the course of the next several years, the larger world of Unitarian Universalism will be having a conversation about reimagining the seven principles. And this is something we are required to do, actually, as an association every 15 years. The seven principles, although they have served us well for over 30 years, were never meant to be a creed. And so beginning this year and continuing through at least 2024, we will have a conversation, all of us collectively, about how we understand the values and commitments at the heart of Unitarian Universalism, and how we best express those commitments. And we may well come away with new language that reframes those commitments for a new century. And it may look like seven principles, or three principles, or nine principles, or no principles. Everything is up for consideration. Now, as you can imagine, this will take time. Changing the principles is serious business, and this will be a multi-year process that requires many conversations and many votes, because that's how we do things as UUs ultimately, right? We talk and we vote, and we talk and we vote. But in the meantime, while this larger conversation is happening, many UU congregations all over the country are right now, this year, moving to adopt the eighth principle for themselves, quite independently of this other conversation. This is a very broad movement within Unitarian Universalism. For example, it is happening here in Indiana, all over the state, in most churches that I can think of, actually, most UU congregations. But it is also happening in every other region of the country, in large UU congregations and small ones. Congregations have assembled task forces and study groups and special eighth principle teams to study the eighth principle within their membership and come to terms with its language and its ideas, and then vote on adopting it at their annual meetings. So why is this happening? Well, it's happening for two reasons. The first reason is that these individual UU congregations are wanting to signal to the larger association that whatever new language is adopted for the seven principles, it ought to include a serious commitment to resisting oppressive social structures and oppressive ideologies at its core. We want 21st century Unitarian Universalism to understand itself as a religion that frees people, frees all people, frees them in body and spirit. We want 21st century Unitarian Universalism to be not just non-racist, that's a given, but anti-racist. We want it to be not just non-sexist, but explicitly committed to undoing sexism, and so on. And the second reason for this move to adopt the eighth principle now is because people are feeling the urgency of this moment, and no one wants to wait around any longer. The eighth principle has been around since the mid-2000s, It has been under serious discussion since at least 2015. Most people back then assumed that the association, meaning all of our congregations, would have adopted it by now. And meanwhile, Charlottesville. And meanwhile, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many other lives lost. Meanwhile, the Me Too movement. Meanwhile, Brett Kavanaugh. Meanwhile, RFRA and the Hobby Lobby decision and rollbacks on protections for LGBTQ people. Meanwhile, Muslim travel bans and mass deportations and kids in cages and build the wall. Meanwhile, COVID and its unequal devastation of our communities. Meanwhile, a Confederate flag and literal Nazis storming our Capitol building. So there's a feeling that now is the time to make explicit as possible, our commitment as Unitarian Universalists to countering the legacies of racism, sexism, homophobia, and all the like in our culture and in our institutions and in our own hearts. Now is the time to be a beacon in our communities. Now is the time to get serious and get real about the dreams we have and the challenges that we face, because if not now, when? And so this spring, UUI will be one of the congregations participating in this national Eighth Principle movement. Beginning in February, the Adult Religious Exploration Committee will be presenting a series of workshops to help us all better understand the history, intent, and implications of this principle. And then this year, we will have the opportunity to vote on adopting the Eighth Principle as a congregation. Now, in practical terms, the purpose of adopting the Eighth Principle is to change in ways large and small the kinds of conversations we have and the kinds of questions we ask as a religious community. To be anti-racist as opposed to non-racist, or anti-sexist as opposed to non-sexist, is first to scrap the protective armor of our own good intentions. It goes without saying that our intentions are good. We are good-hearted, decent, well-meaning people. And we are embedded in a racist and sexist society, and we have inherited racist and sexist structures, assumptions, and practices, and so we assume that even with all the good intentions in the world, we are sometimes reinforcing a racist and sexist status quo with the things that we do. So to be anti-racist is to seek to act intentionally and purposefully to resist and undo that racist and sexist status quo, not to tread water. The idea is to embed in our institutional culture certain practices. It is to remind us to ask when we make decisions, who is sitting at the table and who is not? Whose voices are heard? Whose priorities are reflected in the way we use our resources? It is to remind us to ask ourselves when we do the things we have always done them. Is this reinforcing the norms of white supremacy culture or challenging those norms? Is this reinforcing patriarchy or challenging it? Is this doing the work of liberation or reinforcing the status quo? And can we imagine other ways of doing things, new ways of doing things? And who are our partners in imagination? Who are we in conversation with within the larger community? So the purpose of adopting the Eighth Principle is to keep in the forefront of our minds the water that we're swimming in, and to remind us that to keep treading water is to commit ourselves to collectively drowning. It is to challenge us to take risks as a congregation, because the biggest risk to our long-term spiritual health is to keep on living as though the conditions that surround us are normal, acceptable, expected. And so the Eighth Principle invites us on a journey of transformation, a journey toward wholeness. Transformation can be uncomfortable, even scary. But it can also be joyful, heartfelt, community-building, and liberating. Transformation can free us all together. And so we close today with the same words with which we opened, a prayer for living intention by Joseph Cherry. If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving. Blessed be, and amen.